Three-act story, The Vampire Succubus, Act 1, The encroaching darkness, a restless night. The boy stirred, sheets tangled around his wiry frame. The Georgia night clung thick and humid, yet he shivered beneath its weight. A faint rustle drifted from the corner of the dim room. Barely audible, barely real, eyes wide he strained to pierce the gloom. Nothing, only the pale silver of the moonlight brushing the edges of his cluttered dresser. And yet his chest tightened. A low guttural snort emanated from beneath the bed. Jonah's breath hitched, his body stiff as the wooden floor beneath him creaked. Slowly, ever so slowly, he leaned over the edge of the bed, his fingers gripping the mattress like a lifeline. His wide eyes peered into the murky shadows below. Nothing. Just the faint outline of a forgotten shoe and a crumpled sock. He exhaled shakily, sinking back into the mattress. But as he lay there, his head resting on the damp pillow, something colder than the night air grazed his ankle. His body jolted. The sensation lingered like fingers bony and brittle, curling around his flesh. He jerked his leg up and sat bolt upright, heart hammering against his ribs. The room, bathed in pale moonlight, seemed suddenly too vast. The corners too deep, the walls too thin, the air too still. "Get a grip," he muttered, his voice cracking in the oppressive silence. But as he swung his legs over the side of the bed, they wouldn't touch the floor. His toes brushed air, just air. Then the bed creaked, groaned as though an unseen weight pressed against it. He clutched the frame tightly, eyes darting to the window. The oak outside swayed in a faint breeze, its branches casting long, skeletal fingers across the room. A shape moved just out of sight. It skittered, quick, unnatural. His breath quickened, his body trembling as the sound grew louder. Jonah's lips parted to scream, but no sound came out. And then the darkness beneath the bed shifted, twisting, as something deep and primal reached for him. Act 1.2, The Unseen Visitor. By morning dark crescents pooled beneath his eyes. At breakfast his fork hung suspended mid-air, his gaze fixed on the wall as though expecting it to move. His mother, weary with long shifts at the diner, frowned. "Jonah," she pressed, voice taut. "You're not sleeping again, are you?" He shrugged, swallowing words that would sound absurd. What would big Sis Lana think? He wasn't supposed to be causing their mother trouble. Instead, he focused on the eggs congealing on his plate. Darrell clambered in from the kitchen back door and settled down next to Mrs. Jackson. He looked over the boy and then immediately turned to see his partner's sorrow-etched face. He sighed, then rested a large heavy hand on her shoulder, squeezing it comfortingly. At school, whispers floated through the dusty classroom. The boy's head lolled. His breathing slowed until his body sagged and tumbled to the floor. The teacher's scream shattered the quiet. Jonah's collapse sent a ripple of gasps through the room. Chairs scraped harshly against the old linoleum as students scrambled to their feet, craning to see. The teacher, Mrs. Hartwell, dropped her chalk, her knuckles bright as she gripped the edge of her desk. "Jonah?" Her voice wavered, thin and uncertain. She rushed to his side, kneeling beside his motionless body. The boy's face was pale, almost waxen, with sweat beading on his forehead. His lips, dry and cracked, parted slightly, as though he were trying to speak, but couldn't muster the strength. "Someone get the nurse," Mrs. Hartwell barked, her composure snapping. A girl near the door bolted, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. The room fell eerily silent except for the faint rasp of Jonah's breathing. Mrs. Hartwell pressed her fingers to his wrist, searching for a pulse. Relief flickered across her face as she found it, weak but steady. "Jonah," she tried again, softer this time, shaking his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, his head lolling to the side. A faint groan escaped him, low and pitiful, and his hand twitched as though reaching for something unseen. Then his body stiffened, his back arched unnaturally, a ragged gasp tearing from his throat. The students recoiled, some crying out, others frozen in their seats. Mrs. Hartwell clutched his shoulders, panic etched across her face. "Jonah, stay with me, stay with me." His eyes snapped open, but they weren't right. The deep brown she recognized was gone, replaced by a milky, glazed stare that seemed to see straight through her. His mouth opened wide, a strangled guttural noise spilling out, half scream, half growl. "Get back!" Mrs. Hartwell shouted, shielding him from the students. But just as quickly as the fit had begun, it ended. His body went limp, collapsing into her arms as though a switch had been flipped. The milky glaze faded from his eyes, leaving them dull and half-closed. His breathing slowed, shallow and weak. The nurse burst in, her presence immediately commanding. "Move aside," she ordered, her bag clutched tightly. Mrs. Hartwell obeyed, stepping back as the nurse leaned over Jonah, checking his vitals. "What happened?" the nurse demanded, glancing up at the teacher. Mrs. Hartwell hesitated, words failing her. What could she say? That the boy had looked possessed? That his collapse wasn't just some fainting spell? I don't know, she admitted, her voice shaky. As the nurse worked, Mrs. Hartwell's gaze lingered on Jonah's still form. Something about his pallor, the way he trembled even unconscious, sent a chill through her. Deep down she knew this was no ordinary illness. Something darker had taken hold of Jonah Jackson. Act 1.3, the teacher's warning. "Mrs. Jackson," the woman's voice carried urgency. "Your boy fainted again today. He needs help." The mother bristled, brushing her hair behind her ear. Discomfort etched into every line of her face. "I've been to every doctor this side of Atlanta," she muttered, folding her arms defensively. But the teacher stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Not that kind of help." She scribbled a name onto a piece of paper. "Isaiah Lambert. He deals with." She paused, hesitant. "Things not of this world." She half folded the paper and scrunched it into Mrs. Jackson's hand. Mrs. Hartwell then sandwiched the other woman's cold pale fist between her warm brown hands. Her big dark eyes reflected even more warmth as she burrowed her gaze into Mrs. Jackson's imploringly. "Isaiah Lambert," she repeated again, her voice lowering further. "He deals with the nameless things that haunt your boy." Mrs. Hartwell then pulled back, and Mrs. Jackson stared at the slip of paper slowly unfolding in her hand. The name, scrawled in hurried pen strokes, felt heavier than it should have. Her eyes lifted to meet Mrs. Hartwell's, searching for reassurance. "Things not this world," she repeated, her tone tinged with skepticism. "You mean, like a preacher or something?" Mrs. Hartwell shook her head slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Not quite." She glanced around the empty classroom, her gaze darting to the doorway, as if fearing someone might overhear. Then she leaned in closer. "Look, I've seen things. Heard things. Back home in Louisiana, they call it hoodoo. It's real. Isaiah knows how to handle it." Mrs. Jackson hesitated, her fingers tightening around the paper. "You're saying my boy's cursed?" Mrs. Hartwell's face softened. "I don't know." Her eyes didn't waver. "But I know what I saw today wasn't normal." She hesitated again. "And I've seen this kind of thing before." Mrs. Jackson took a step back, shaking her head. "This is crazy. Jonah just needs rest. Maybe more iron in his diet or something." "I don't need some." Her voice faltered. "Do you hear him crying out at night?" Mrs. Hartwell asked, her voice sharp. "Does he wake up gasping for air? Has he been fading?" The words hit hard. Mrs. Jackson felt her throat tighten, denial stuck like a stone. She had heard it, seen it, the way Jonah's once bright eyes had dulled, the way his laughter had disappeared into silence, the way he'd become a shadow. Mrs. Hartwell stepped closer, her hand firm on Mrs. Jackson's shoulder. "Whatever's happening to him, it's not going to stop on its own. Call Isaiah, please." Mrs. Jackson swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the name on the paper. "I'll think about it," she mumbled, though her heart already knew the truth. End of Act 1. Act 2. The fight for deliverance. Isaiah arrived just before dusk, his presence heralded by the sweet, bright, clean chime of glass bells that dangled from his locks. His long coat, faded from years under relentless sun, brushed against the wooden floor as he stepped into the small house. Salt and dried herbs spilled from his satchel. Jonah sat stiffly on the sofa, his skin pale as wax. Isaiah bent down, studying the boy's hollow cheeks and cracked lips. "She's been feeding on him for weeks," he said grimly. His fingers worked quickly, carving sigils into the wood of the window frame. The house felt heavier with each step Isaiah took, the air oppressive, as if thickened by unseen forces. He walked the perimeter of the living room, his boots echoing against the floorboards. Every now and then he paused, muttering in a low, steady cadence that sent chills up Mrs. Jackson's spine. "Where's his room?" he asked, turning to her abruptly. She gestured toward the hallway, her voice catching. "First door on the left," Isaiah nodded, adjusting the strap of his satchel. He reached inside and retrieved a small bundle of sage, bound tightly with twine, and a bottle filled with a viscous, dark liquid. Without another word he made his way to Jonah's room, Mrs. Jackson trailing behind. The boy's room was small, cluttered with a mix of childhood toys and discarded clothes. The window was slightly ajar, the curtains swaying lazily in the faint evening breeze. Isaiah froze, his eyes narrowing as he approached the window. "She's been here." Mrs. Jackson's breath hitched. "What, here? How do you know?" Isaiah held up a hand, silencing her. He pointed to the faint marks scratched into the wood near the sill. They were jagged and irregular, but unmistakable. Claw marks. He placed the sage bundle on the windowsill and lit it, the sharp herbal smoke curling upward. As he worked, he sprinkled the dark liquid along the edges of the frame, chanting under his breath. The words were foreign, ancient, but they filled the room with a strange, vibrating energy. Behind him Mrs. Jackson wrung her hands. Is this really going to help him?" Isaiah turned, his gaze unwavering. "It'll slow her down, but it won't stop her." Mrs. Jackson's knees nearly buckled. She gripped the edge of Jonah's desk for support, her heart hammering. "What do you mean?" "Isn't that what you're here to do?" Isaiah's face softened, but his eyes were tired. "I'm here to fight her, but she's old, powerful, and she's marked him as hers." Mrs. Jackson swallowed hard, the reality sinking in like cold iron. Jonah was upstairs, lying in his bed, oblivious to the battle being waged on his behalf. Isaiah reached into his bag once more, pulling out a small charm made of bone and twine. He placed it on the nightstand, his voice steady. "This will keep her out tonight, but tomorrow we'll need to go on the offensive. If we don't, she'll take him completely." Mrs. Jackson nodded, though her legs trembled. She had no choice but to trust this man. For Jonah's sake she'd do anything. Act 2.2. Charms and countermeasures. As the night deepened, the house grew silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the old clock in the living room. Isaiah sat cross-legged in the center of Jonah's room, his hands resting lightly on his knees. A circle of salt surrounded him and the boy's bed, the boundary reinforced with carefully placed talismans. The sage continued to smolder in the corner, its faint glow pulsing in time with Isaiah's low, resonant chants. Jonah stirred fitfully on the bed, his breathing shallow. His skin, pallid and clammy, glistened faintly in the dim light of the room. His mother sat by the door, clutching a rosary in one hand and wringing the hem of her dress with the other. "What's happening to him?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over Isaiah's chanting. Isaiah didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained shut, his focus unbroken as he recited the ancient incantations. After a moment he exhaled deeply, opening his eyes to meet hers. "She's trying to get through, but the wards are holding, for now." Isaiah's chants rose and fell in rhythm, the air thick with incense. The boy stirred, eyelids fluttering as if in protest. But just as hope flickered, a deep rumble echoed. Suddenly the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began to creep along the edges of the window, and the once faint breeze outside escalated into a howling wind. The lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. Jonah's body arched off the bed, a guttural cry tearing from his throat. "Isaiah!" Mrs. Jackson screamed, rushing toward her son. "Don't cross the salt," Isaiah barked, his voice sharp. He rose to his feet, his presence commanding as he held up a charm that glinted dully in the flickering light. The shadows in the room thickened, pooling in the corners like ink. From the darkness a low growl emerged, guttural and primal. Mrs. Jackson clutched her rosary tighter, her knuckles white as terror gripped her. And then it appeared, a monstrous, hulking form, its body twisted and hunched, barely visible in the dim light. Coarse hair covered its frame, and its elongated limbs ended in claws that scraped against the floor. Its eyes, two glowing embers, locked onto Jonah's prone form. Isaiah stepped forward, his voice rising as he chanted. The talismans around the room seemed to hum in response, their light flaring against the encroaching darkness. The creature hissed, a sound that rattled the very air, before lunging toward the bed. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, as though it were fighting against invisible chains. Isaiah thrust the charm forward, its light blazing like a miniature sun. The creature recoiled, its snarls turning into guttural screeches. It clawed at the air, its body writhing as the light seared its form. "Hold on, Jonah!" Isaiah shouted, his voice filled with both power and desperation. Jonah let out another cry, his back arching as though he were being pulled by invisible strings. The salt circle around the bed sparked and flared, holding back the creature, but barely. The beast slammed against the barrier again, its claws raking the air just inches from Isaiah's face. Sweat poured down his brow as he tightened his grip on the charm, his voice rising in an incantation that made the very air vibrate. The creature howled, a sound that was equal parts rage and agony, before retreating into the shadows. The oppressive weight in the room lifted slightly, though the air still felt thick with tension. Isaiah staggered, his shoulders heaving as he caught his breath. "It's not over," he muttered, his voice hoarse. He turned to Mrs. Jackson, who was trembling by the doorway. "She'll come back, stronger. We've bought time, but not much." Mrs. Jackson nodded, her face pale but resolute. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear lingering in her eyes. Isaiah glanced at Jonah, who lay limp and unconscious on the bed. "Tomorrow we take the fight to her." One shadow pulled out, tenacious, angry, and quaking. But with a fierce rattle of Isaiah's locks it was gone. Act 2.3. The ghoul unveiled, Mrs. Jackson sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling around a mug of lukewarm tea. The events of the night had left her hollow, her mind racing with questions and fears. Isaiah leaned against the counter, his satchel open beside him as he meticulously cleaned a set of small rune-etched daggers. Her eldest daughter, Alana, paced the room. The young woman, just home from college, had been skeptical when her mother had called her earlier in the evening. Now, after seeing Jonah's pale, fragile form and hearing Isaiah's grim warnings, skepticism had turned to dread. "This thing," Alana said, breaking the tense silence. "Why Jonah? Why not someone else?" Isaiah paused, his sharp eyes lifting to meet hers. "Because she's marked him. Vampires like her don't feed randomly. They choose carefully, targeting those they can control. The more they feed, the stronger the bond becomes." Alana stopped pacing, her arms crossed. "But why him?" she pressed. "What makes Jonah so special?" Before Isaiah could answer, the front door creaked open. Mrs. Jackson shot to her feet, the mug clattering to the table. A familiar figure stepped inside, Darrell, her boyfriend of nearly a year. His usually warm smile was absent, replaced by a strange stillness in his features. "Darrell," Mrs. Jackson's voice wavered. "What are you doing here?" "I thought you were working late." Darrell didn't respond immediately. He stepped further into the room, his movements slow, almost mechanical. The air grew colder, faint smell of decay wafting in with him. Isaiah's hand subtly moved toward the dagger on the counter, his expression darkening. Something's not right. Darrell's gaze finally met Mrs. Jackson's, but his eyes were wrong. The usual warmth was gone, replaced by an unnatural dullness. His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You've been busy," he said, his voice hollow and flat. "Bringing strangers into the house. Meddling where you shouldn't." Mrs. Jackson's stomach dropped. "What? What are you talking about?" she stammered. Darrell tilted his head, his smile widening unnaturally. "She doesn't like that, you know. My mistress. She doesn't take kindly to interference." The room fell deathly silent. Alana stepped closer to her mother, her eyes darting between Darryl and Isaiah. "What the hell is he talking about?" Alana demanded. Isaiah's voice was steady but cold. "He's a ghoul, turned by the vampire to do her bidding. He's been keeping tabs on you, feeding her information, sabotaging your efforts." Mrs. Jackson staggered back, shaking her head. "No, no, that's not possible." Darryl he couldn't. "Open your eyes," Isaiah snapped. "Look at him. Does that look like the man you've been dating?" Darryl's smile twisted into a snarl, his body convulsing as he lunged toward Isaiah. The spirit doctor moved swiftly, snatching up the dagger and raising it in defense. The two collided with a sickening thud, Darryl's inhuman strength pushing Isaiah back against the counter. Alana grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung it with all her might, striking Darryl in the side of the head. He stumbled, but it wasn't enough to bring him down. His head snapped toward her, a guttural growl rumbling from his throat. "Stay back," Isaiah shouted, plunging the dagger into Darryl's chest. The ghoul screamed, a sound that was both human and monstrous, as black ichor oozed from the wound. Darryl collapsed to the floor, his body twitching before falling still. The room was silent once more, the air heavy with the stench of decay. Isaiah wiped the blade clean, his expression grim. "This is what we're up against," he said, his voice low. "She's been working through him for months. Every setback, every failure, it was him." Mrs. Jackson sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Alana placed a reassuring hand on her mother's shoulder, her voice trembling, but firm. "We'll stop her, Mama, for Jonah." Isaiah nodded, his eyes blazing with determination. "She'll know we're coming now," he said. "But this ends tomorrow. Act 3, the vampiress, arrival." The night was unnaturally quiet. The cicadas ever present in the southern heat had stilled, leaving an eerie silence that pressed against the walls of the Jackson home. Mrs. Jackson, Alana, and Isaiah stood just side Jonah's room, their breaths shallow as they prepared for the confrontation that would decide everything. Isaiah's voice broke the silence, calm but resolute. "This isn't just about Jonah anymore. She won't stop until she's destroyed, and she's not going to make it easy." Mrs. Jackson tightened her grip on the iron poker she'd taken from the fireplace. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were steady. "She's taken too much already. Whatever it takes, we end this tonight." Alana nodded, clutching the silver-edged knife, with a ruby embedded at its core. Isaiah had given it to her earlier. Alana knitted her brows with determination. "Drive the ruby into her, and then they can begin the unbinding." "I won't fail," she mouthed to herself. She met Isaiah's gaze and nodded with determination. "I'm ready," she said, though her voice betrayed a flicker of fear. Isaiah adjusted the talismans draped around his neck and shoulders, his fingers brushing over the smooth bone charms and worn leather bindings. "Stay close to the salt ring. If you're forced out of it, fight to get back. Don't let her separate us." The three entered the room together, their steps slow and deliberate. Jonah lay motionless on the bed, his face a ghostly white, his chest barely rising and falling. The salt circle around his bed glowed faintly, the protective barrier pulsing with a soft, ethereal light. Then the temperature in the room dropped. Frost crept along the window pane, spreading in jagged patterns. The air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural presence. "She's here," Isaiah murmured, his grip tightening on his blade. From the shadows in the corner a low growl rumbled. It vibrated through the room, deep and guttural, like the warning of a beast. The darkness shifted, moving like smoke, and then she emerged. The vampire was monstrous, her body twisted and hunched, covered in coarse, matted hair. Long clawed limbs stretched out, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her glowing red eyes burned with malice as she fixed her gaze on Jonah. "You dare challenge me?" Her voice was a guttural hiss, layered with an unnatural resonance that made the air tremble. Isaiah stepped forward, his voice firm as he held up a talisman. "You've fed long enough. Come now, meet your end, death whore." The vampire let out a guttural laugh that turned into a snarl. She lunged, her claws raking the air, but Isaiah was ready. He thrust the talisman forward, the glow intensifying as it repelled her attack. "Alana now," Isaiah shouted. Alana darted forward, her knife glinting in the dim light. She slashed at the vampire's flank, the silver blade searing her flesh. The creature screamed, a sound that was both human and animal, and recoiled. As soon as Alana caught her footing once more, she checked the blade. She had definitely heard a click, and to her relief, the ruby was gone, lodged inside the writhing entrails of the she-beast. Now all they had to do was buy time. Mrs. Jackson took her chance. She swung the iron poker with all her strength, the metal connecting with the vampire's side. The creature staggered, her movements wild as she lashed out, claws tearing through the air. Isaiah raised his voice, chanting an incantation that made the walls seem to shudder. The salt circle around Jonah's bed flared brightly, and the vampire shrieked as the light seared her flesh. "Weaken her, drive her back," Isaiah yelled, his voice ringing with urgency. The three attacked in unison, their strikes coordinated and relentless. The vampire thrashed, her monstrous form writhing as she struggled to escape. But the combined power of the talismans, the blessed weapons, and their determination overwhelmed her. Finally, with one final piercing scream, the vampire fell, her monstrous form falling out of sight and into one of the room's darkest shadows. Isaiah immediately plucked up a candle and dispersed the blackness. Nothing. He bent down and ran his fingers over the carpet. Not a hint of ashes escaped. The two women wailed in exasperation and dread. Isaiah lowered his blade, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Mrs. Jackson dropped the iron poker, her hands shaking as tears streamed down her face. Alana knelt by Jonah's bedside, her fingers brushing his cold hand. "It's not over," Isaiah said softly, his voice weary but resolute. "The hard part is over. At the very least the ruby will begin to poison her. She will return." Mrs. Jackson nodded, her voice trembling as she whispered, "For Jonah." The night was quiet once more, the dread still clinging to every fibre of the bedroom. Act 3.3. The finale. The final confrontation. The house was still, save for the faint creak of floorboards as Mrs. Jackson, Alana, and Isaiah moved toward the basement. Isaiah had insisted they lure the vampire to a confined space, where her agility and size would be limited. The basement was damp and dim, its air heavy with the scent of earth and mildew. Isaiah held a lantern, its flickering light casting long jagged shadows across the stone walls. In his other hand he gripped a talisman etched with runes that glowed faintly. Mrs. Jackson followed close behind, clutching her iron poker, her knuckles white with tension. Alana brought up the rear, her silver-edged knife gleaming, her breath slow but deliberate. "Stay sharp," Isaiah whispered. "She'll be desperate now." Cornered animals are always the most dangerous. They formed a loose circle in the center of the room, surrounding a ritual Isaiah had prepared earlier, a series of runes drawn in chalk, with candles placed at precise intervals. A ring of salt encircled the markings, and in the center lay a small bowl of dark liquid. "Will this hold her?" Alana asked, her voice tight. Isaiah's expression was grim. "If we're lucky, it'll weaken her long enough for us to finish her off. But don't count on luck. Be ready." The silence was broken by a low guttural growl that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. The shadows at the edges of the basement shifted, coalescing into a thick, impenetrable darkness. "She's here," Isaiah said, his low and steady. A chilling laugh echoed through the room, followed by the sound of claws scraping against stone. The vampire stepped into the dim light, her monstrous form even more grotesque than before. Her body was hunched and twisted, her limbs elongated and tipped with razor-sharp claws. Coarse hair bristled along her spine, and her glowing red eyes burned with fury. "You think you can trap me?" she hissed, her voice layered with malice and disdain. "I'm eternal. You are nothing but dust and flesh." Isaiah stepped forward, his talisman held high. "Eternal or not, tonight you fall," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. The vampire lunged, her speed astonishing despite her grotesque size. Isaiah swung the talisman in a wide arc, its glow flaring as it repelled her. She screeched, clawing at the air as the energy burned her skin. "Alana now," Isaiah shouted. Alana darted forward, her knife slashing through the air. The silver blade sliced into the vampire's arm, sending black ichor spraying across the floor. The creature howled, reeling back, but her movements were frenzied rather than retreating. Mrs. Jackson struck next, swinging the iron poker with all her strength. The blow connected with the vampire's torso, the sound of cracking bone echoing through the basement. The creature staggered, her claws raking against the walls as she tried to regain her balance. The vampire let out a guttural snarl and turned on Mrs. Jackson, her claws swiping dangerously close to her head. Alana leapt between them, her blade flashing as she drove it into the creature's side. Her gnarly thick hair burst off her body in flames, and the tender flesh beneath was scored by glowing red veins. The ruby! Alana gasped. The vampire shrieked, her movements becoming more erratic as the blessed weapons and charms took their toll. Isaiah stepped into the circle of runes, chanting an incantation that reverberated through the basement. The salt ring flared brightly, and the candle's flames shot upward, casting the room in an eerie, flickering glow. "Keep her inside the circle," he yelled. The vampire lunged at Isaiah, but the barrier of salt stopped her short. She thrashed and snarled, her claws tearing at the air, but the glowing symbols held firm. Mrs. Jackson took a step forward, her poker raised. Her voice trembled, but was resolute. "For Jonah," she whispered, swinging the weapon with all her might. The iron poker struck the vampire's skull, the force of the blow sending her to the ground. Alana was on her in an instant, driving her silver blade into the creature's chest. The vampire let out a final piercing scream, her body convulsing as the energy of the ritual consumed her. Her form crumbled, disintegrating into ash that scattered across the basement floor. Isaiah lowered the talisman, his shoulders sloped with exhaustion. The candles flickered out, leaving the room in near darkness. Mrs. Jackson dropped the poker, tears streaming down her face. Alana knelt beside her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "It's over," Isaiah softly. Mrs. Jackson nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. For Jonah, the basement was quiet once more, the weight of the battle lingering in the air. Yet, for the first time in weeks, the oppressive darkness had lifted. The stillness of the basement felt almost unnatural, as though the world had held its breath in that final, violent moment, only now exhaling slowly. The air, once thick with malevolent energy, had cleared, but the lingering traces of the struggle remained in the battered, ash-covered floor. Mrs. Jackson's hands still shook as she wiped her tears away, the raw, aching grief of her son's suffering mixing with a flood of relief. Alana stood beside her, her breath coming in shallow gasps, the weight of the battle settling in her bones. Her knife, still gripped tightly in her hand, was stained with black ichor, the very mark of what they had fought against. She looked down at her mother, meeting her gaze, before glancing at the empty, desolate space where the vampire had been. "We did it, Mama," Alana whispered, her voice hoarse, her heart still racing from the adrenaline that had coursed through her. Isaiah lowered his head, his expression solemn but resolute as he examined the room. The runes had faded, the salt circle now an ordinary ring of white powder. "Not yet," he said quietly, breaking the fragile silence. The words hit Mrs. Jackson like a sudden chill. She looked up at him, the fear creeping back into her chest. "What do you mean? She's gone, she's—" Isaiah raised his hand, silencing her. "She's gone, but not entirely. The connection she forged with Jonah is deeper than what we've just severed." Mrs. Jackson's heart sank. Isaiah moved to the center of the room, his eyes scanning the remnants of the ritual. He bent down, his fingers brushing the ash that had once been the vampire. The symbols were still faintly glowing, the dark liquid in the bowl now swirling in an unnatural motion. "She's cursed him in a way we didn't anticipate," Isaiah continued, his voice low and grave. "Her spirit, her essence, is tethered to him. We may have killed her body, but the damage she did to Jonah, It runs deeper than we thought." Alana took a step forward. "What are you saying? He's not going to be like her, is he?" Isaiah stood slowly, his eyes filled with a sorrowful understanding. "He won't turn into her, but unless we break the last of her influence, unless we sever that tether completely, he'll remain trapped between life and death, caught in the shadows of her grasp." Mrs. Jackson gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Not my baby, not after everything." Isaiah's gaze softened, and for the first time since they had begun this fight, there was a glimmer of compassion in his eyes. "We can save him, but we need to do it quickly. There's a ritual, one more step, to finally sever the last of her hold on him. If we fail—" His voice trailed off, but the unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Jackson looked down at Jonah, his body still limp on the bed, his face as pale as death itself. She stepped forward, placing a trembling hand on his forehead. Tears fell freely from her eyes. "Then we'll do it, whatever it takes." Isaiah nodded, but the weight of the final battle loomed before them. The vampire was gone, but her legacy remained in Jonah, an unholy tether that would not break without a final, devastating fight. As the air grew still once more, the only sound in the room was the soft, unsteady rhythm of Jonah's breathing and the gentle ringing of glass bells. The battle was over, but the war was far from won, and as the dawn began to creep through the cracks in the basement window, casting a pale light over the room, Mrs. Jackson knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The first rays of dawn seeped through the small window above the basement stairs, casting long shadows across the room. The faint light held no warmth, as if the world outside had yet to fully wake from the horrors that had unfolded within these walls. Mrs. Jackson, her heart heavy with dread, stood beside Jonah's bed watching him intently. His body was still and pale, his breath faint, almost imperceptible. Isaiah's words from the night before echoed in her mind, refusing to fade. The battle had been won, but the war was not yet over. Jonah's life still hung in the balance, tethered to the spirit of the vampire who had nearly claimed him as her own. Isaiah stood at the center of the room, his back straight and his movements deliberate. He had already prepared the space for the final ritual. The chalk markings, fresh and precise, formed a tight circle around Jonah's bed, with candles placed at key points. At the center, a dark stone slab rested, inscribed with symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim light. Alana moved beside her mother, her gaze locked on Jonah's face. She squeezed Mrs. Jackson's hand, a silent reassurance, though both of them knew what was at stake. "Isaiah," Mrs. Jackson said, her voice trembling slightly. "What now? How do we finish this?" Isaiah glanced over his shoulder, his eyes steady but filled with the weight of what was to come. "Now we draw her out." His tone was resolute. "This final ritual will sever the tether between Jonah and her spirit. But it's not a simple thing." He paused, taking a deep breath. "The vampire's essence is powerful, woven into him more deeply than we anticipated. It will fight us, and if we aren't careful, the last piece of her might destroy him." Mrs. Jackson's chest tightened. Her son, the boy she had fought so fiercely to protect, was still teetering on the edge of life and death. The thought that they might lose him now, after everything, felt unbearable. She turned to Alana, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Stay close, don't let go of him." "We'll do this together," Alana nodded, her face pale but determined. Isaiah's attention shifted back to the symbols, his fingers brushing over the runes etched in the stone slab. "This will draw her spirit into the center of the circle. Once she's there, the talisman will seal her. But you must be prepared for anything." With a deep breath, Isaiah began chanting, his voice low and rhythmic, the words of the ancient incantation flowing smoothly as though he had recited them 1,000 times before. The air grew thick and charged, vibrating with energy as the symbols on the stone slab began to glow. The candles flickered violently, their flames stretching and bending as if being pulled by an unseen force. Jonah's body twitched, his face contorting in pain. Mrs. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. His eyes fluttered open, but the pupils were wide and unfocused, an unnatural gleam taking the place of his usual warmth. He began to whisper, his voice faint and hollow, the words nearly unintelligible. "Mother, I'm so sorry." The salt circle shattered. A shadow, monstrous and writhing, tore through the boy's defenses, engulfing him. Seeping into him in an instant, Jonah's body rose, suspended in mid-air, his life force draining away. Alana screamed. Then Jonah's body fell like a stone back onto the bed with a sickening thud. The frame buckled and curved in with a loud crack. Mrs. Jackson rushed to his side, her hand on his forehead, her voice filled with both love and anguish. "Jonah, baby, you're going to be all right. We're finishing this. Stay with me." For a moment the room held its breath. And then a guttural growl rumbled through the air, low and predatory. The temperature plummeted. A shadow twisted and writhed around Jonah, coiling and twisting like smoke. It formed slowly and deliberately into the vampire's twisted shape. Her grotesque, monstrous figure reappeared, her eyes burning red with hunger and malice. She snarled as she lurched toward Jonah, her claws reaching for him. Isaiah didn't flinch. His voice rose with power, his chant growing louder, more forceful. "Begone!" The circle of runes flared with blinding light, the symbols pulsing and expanding outward as the vampire's form faltered. A scream tore from her lips, a sound that shattered the stillness of the room. Alana rushed forward, placing her hand over Jonah's heart as Isaiah's chant intensified. The vampire shrieked, her form flickering between corporeal and spectral as the salt circle refused and pushed against her, the energy binding her to the stone slab at the center. Mrs. Jackson raised the iron poker, her grip steady despite the fear that had gripped her heart. With one final surge of strength, Isaiah thrust the talisman into the air, and the vampire's form twisted violently before disintegrating into a cloud of black ash. As the last remnants of the vampire's spirit dissipated into the ether, the room fell silent once more. The heavy weight of the battle, the exhaustion, and the fear seemed to lift, leaving only the faint crackle of the candles flickering out. Jonah's breathing slowed. His face softened, the unnatural tension leaving his features. Mrs. Jackson collapsed into the chair beside him, tears streaming down her face. Alana knelt beside her, her hand on Jonah's chest, feeling his heart beat erratically, then steady, then softly, then slowly, then stop. Isaiah exhaled deeply, his forehead dripping with sweat, shoulders slumping and his back bending with tiredness. "It's done." Mrs. Jackson looked down at Jonah, her hands still trembling as she stroked his hair. "For Jonah," she whispered again, the weight of the last days finally lifting from her chest. The nightmare was over. Alana dared not weep. She stared out into the air, allowing the room to finally settle. The end. This was the Vampire Succubus. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe.